Hello and welcome to our discussion of the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about with this story is the setting. Again, let me caution you as to how much the setting you can discuss in your first essay. If you choose setting as one of your literary terms, to analyze the short story that you choose, remember that you can only use as much as the author is putting within the story. So for this story, in the story of an hour, I'm going to give you setting that is outside of what the author mentions. So if you choose a story, you need to avoid those things. You might not want to choose setting. You might want to choose something like narration and symbols. All right, so we're going to talk about the temporal setting first. This takes place approximately the same time as A Story of an Hour does. Again, if you'll remember from the naturalism realism notes, these two literary periods are taking place mostly simultaneously. So you're talking about the mid to late 1800s. Now, what's important about the temporal setting here is all the same stuff that applies to the Story of an Hour, but we're going to add one component, and that is the way medical doctors viewed women in our narrator's position. So in this story, her husband, John, who's also a doctor, talks about her having something called neurasthenia, which is basically what they would have called just a mental disorder dealing with anxiety or nervous condition. So what we would call this now is postpartum depression. Postpartum depression is really a 21st century, I'm going to say discovery. I was going to say phenomenon. That's not quite right because it certainly existed before the 21st century. It just wasn't recognized and seen for what it actually is. So during this time period, in the mid to late 1800s, there's a doctor called Weir Mitchell. I think that's how you pronounce his first name, W-E-I-R. It might be German, so it might be a different pronunciation. But he developed what he called a rest cure for women. And this essentially was the idea that women who were struggling after giving birth with what we now call postpartum depression, he would prescribe them a rest cure in which they would do pretty much nothing for about 6 weeks after they were diagnosed. And I mean nothing. So we see the husband, John, who is also a doctor, prescribing this for his wife, and we see how he restricts what she does. So she's not taking care of her baby. She is not writing. She's not really going outside. She's not doing any household chores. And on the surface, that might seem kind of like a great idea. We're giving mom a break after the difficulty of having a child, right? Which you can imagine in mid to late 1800s is much more difficult and scary than it is now in the 21st century. But what they're prescribing, this complete rest, is actually very detrimental from a psychiatric mental health point of view. If you think about just things that we casually know now about anxiety and depression, we know that putting a person in a room alone with no mental stimulation, with nothing to occupy themselves, with no creative outlet is really, really very dangerous. Now I'm bringing all this up not only because it's important for understanding the story, but also because we see that it is quite in fact detrimental, and to let you know that the author, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, is writing from personal experience. Now, she is not supposed to literally be the narrator in the story, but she is someone who experienced this rest cure. And she says, hey, it almost killed me. It almost literally drove me insane. And when she was done with the rescuer, she ended up leaving her husband and writing to Dr. Mitchell and saying this is very, very dangerous. And it actually got Dr. Mitchell to rethink this. So in the story, we see that Charlotte Perkins Gilman isn't just blaming the idea of this rescuer. She's also putting a certain amount of blame on the husband, and not just the husband as a doctor, but we'll get to all that a little bit later. So that is the temporal setting. That is what you kind of need to know about the time period, what the author is dealing with, and what she's letting us know that the narrator is dealing with. All right, so let's go to spatial. This is a story in which this is going to be a little bit odd for naturalism because it's not taking place in a truly rural location, but it's not taking place in an urban setting either. So it's really more the context rather than the spatial setting that connects with this idea of naturalism. So the spatial setting is this kind of country home. It's probably a large colonial house. Well, it is a large colonial house. Multiple floors. They are comfortably middle class. That's something else that kind of deviates from your typical naturalism story. They're well off enough to have a housekeeper or to have a maid. So they're not completely isolated. So the isolation here is a little more symbolic than it is in other stories. But I want you to notice that much like in the story of an hour, we don't see the main character getting outside of her spatial setting very much. She is mostly in that nursery room on the 3rd floor, an area with bars on the windows, this sickly yellow wallpaper that she hates. Her bed is bolted to the floor, and she doesn't really see anybody much. She is in many ways isolated the way characters would be in a very rural setting. Let's talk a little bit more about this spatial setting when we talk about the atmosphere here. So that isolation is part of the atmosphere. The fact that the room feels so oppressive to her is part of the atmosphere as well. All of this leads to this feeling of increasing paranoia, this increasing feeling of concern about her own mental health, and then the letting go of sanity in order to make herself feel better. So this is another place I want to talk about how the atmosphere shifts. We talked about that in the story of an hour. And the theme or the topic of the story is one of isolation. It is one of oppression. But I want you to think of kind of the ironic twist that Gilman gives us in the ending. You have that oppressive feeling, that increasing paranoia, but at the end of the story, you see that the narrator isn't feeling oppressed. She feels like she's free. And that's quite ironic because the only way she got her freedom was by literally going insane. She thinks she has the upper hand now. She feels like she knows better and is doing better than John. And she even calls John silly. He passes out and she continues to creep around the room over him when she needs to. So she is no longer paranoid. She's no longer worried. She feels like she has broken out. So the atmosphere does shift, but in this very ironic and unsettling way. Right, so let's talk about our narration here. Now, I do have, along with the lecture on naturalism, some notes on narration. So I want to talk about that a little bit here, but hopefully you've looked at the narration notes before this. So we do have a first-person narrative here, first-person limited. It is our main character who does not have a name, or she does have a name, but she's not given a formal name in this story, and she is telling us through her diary entries what is happening to her. So there are a couple of things that are very important about that. One, the first person narrative allows us to recognize kind of subtly that this person doesn't have a name. Now, it would be really odd if in your own diary you were calling yourself by name, right? So we may not notice that at first. We may notice that the only female names mentioned are Jane and Jenny, and there's some discussion about who these people are. One of them may be a sister, the other one may be a housekeeper, a family member. It's a little bit unclear, and that's kind of fine because we're reading the diary of someone who has lost her connection with reality. But what we can say definitively is that we do not know this narrator's actual given name. Now, that's not to say that nobody ever calls her anything. Her husband has multiple names for her, and none of them are her given name. He calls her dear and darling. He calls her a silly little goose at one point. And the one that kind of creeps me out the most is he calls her little girl. Now, he calls her all of these things in an attempt to show affection and an attempt to comfort her. But some of the most degrading things he calls her, little goose and little girl, are when she is trying to be honest with him about her mental state. He talks about how much better she's getting, and she says, well, physically, maybe I'm better, but mentally I'm not. And at that point, the husband cuts her off, and he calls her this series of kind of degrading but affectionate names. You know, little girl is just an odd thing to call your wife, and it's degrading. It is telling her, you don't know what you're talking about. You're not the expert in your own health. I am, because I'm your husband and I'm a doctor. So listen to what I'm saying. What you're saying is silly and ridiculous and childish. So that kind of adds to the feeling of oppression and helplessness in the story of when this woman is telling the person that she loves the most and who loves her the most and wants to be taking care of her. He won't listen to her. And kind of like with Brentley Mallard in the Story of an Hour, we can debate whether or not this is really his fault. If you buy into naturalism, then you can see that John, the doctor, is just acting the way he has been taught by society to behave. And he is expecting his wife to be a certain way because that is what society has told him is true of women and is true of men. But when the narrator genuinely tries to convey something important to him, he either cannot or will not hear it. So it takes that dramatic picture of her at the end when she has just lost the plot, as the British would say, and she really has no idea what's going on in reality, for him to understand that she was right, that her mental state has not improved. It has degraded quite a bit. All right, so that's part of what's important with first person. And another thing that's important in first person is that we get to hear all of the things that she cannot share with her husband. We get to see this slow increase of paranoia, this slow building of not being able to control her own thoughts or to marshal her own thoughts and say, all right, what I'm thinking is not rational. Let me try to figure this out here. And the diary entries and the first person allow us to see this. She goes from not really liking the area that she's in, this nursery, to kind of making fun of, you know, who would put their children up here? This is kind of crazy. I don't want to be here. To kind of being disgusted and uncomfortable with her surroundings, to not wanting to leave. There is a time, and I'll talk about this with the next slide, that she goes from looking outside those windows with bars on them, and wanting to be in this green garden away from the yellow, to the very end where she's saying they want to get me outside where there's all that green and I just want to stay in here with this yellow. And that's significant, the color. But the diary entries are what allow us to see her reflecting her own thoughts honestly. Why would you lie, excuse me, in your own diary? That doesn't make sense. So we assume that she's telling us the truth, but we can also see that her narrative is becoming increasingly unreliable. So if you've looked at that narration, those narration notes, this is a classic example of an unreliable narrator. She starts out being pretty reliable, and at the end, she is not at all reliable. She is not seeing reality. All right, so let's talk about theme. I want to say quite a bit here. I probably should have broken this into a couple different ideas, but let's talk about the theme of oppression. Now, I talked about that a little bit with this setting and with how her husband talks to her, but let's talk about the colored yellow and what that has to do with oppression and the theme, and why Gilman may have chosen it, or why it may have been just kind of a lucky idea that she chose yellow. Now, yellow can be thought of as being very sunny and bright and cheerful, but there is such a thing as color symbolism, color theory. There are several different names for it, but these ideas that when you paint the walls of a room, that you want to be careful what color you choose, because it can have an impact on the mood, the feeling of that room. And yellow is a color that, although it can be bright and cheerful, people also warn that it can increase mania. So if somebody is already struggling with anxiety, yellow would not be a great color to surround them with. It will kind of increase their anxiety. And with color symbolism, along with being cheerful and bright, yellow is also associated with sickness. When somebody is jaundiced, they're yellow. And it's also associated with cowardice. If you remember Yosemite Sam, he would often call his enemies, you yellow-bellied, lily-livered, whatever, whatever. So that yellow-bellied, that means that you're scared, you're a coward, you're not brave. So all of those things kind of go into this idea that she's surrounded by this yellow color that is not cheerful. She notices immediately that it is this sickly yellow color that makes her very uncomfortable. And of course, John kind of dismisses that. And that shift to the green. Green is, yes, often the color of money, the color of greed. But if you look at color symbolism, it's also associated with health and new life, which is important for this narrator in several ways. One, she has just had a baby, so green could be this celebration of new life, but it could also be talking about her own mental health. She needs to get somewhere away from the yellow to the green. That doesn't happen, so she sort of reverses her like and dislike of those two colors by the end of the story. She's no longer craving things that are fresh and green. She is content to stay in that yellow, sickly place. So if Charlotte Perkins Gilman's story is about oppression, and we could say it's about multiple things, but I'm going to go with oppression to give you an example, then you might say that Charlotte Perkins Gilman expresses the theme of oppression using symbols such as the bars on the window, the yellow wallpaper, and the woman, the figure stuck in the wallpaper. So let me continue away from theme and talk about a few more of those symbols. So we have that yellow wallpaper. We do have the bars on the windows, the green outside that we've just talked about. Let's talk about this figure in the wallpaper. So this is one of the things that allows us to see the main character's increased paranoia, increased detachment from reality. So at first she's just following this pattern, right? She's just looking and trying to figure out where the pattern repeats, what the pattern is supposed to be, and she can't. And the longer that she can't understand the pattern, the more obsessed that she becomes with it. Basically because she has nothing else to do. She's not even supposed to be writing in this diary. She can't bring herself to take care of her baby. So there's nothing for her to do when this room is set rest, and as she's resting, she's looking at this wallpaper. So she goes from trying to figure out that pattern to eventually seeing eyes, and from seeing eyes in the pattern of the wallpaper, she starts to see a figure, and then from a figure she starts to see a woman, and then she is seeing this woman is trapped and she's trying to get her out. And one of the ways she's trying to get her out is to peel that wallpaper off the wall, to pull it down, to try to pull down those bars so this woman can escape. Now, this woman is symbolic of the narrator herself. She is stuck in this room, quite literally. So pulling off that wallpaper is part of her attempt to escape. But she is also talking about women in general. She is not the only woman who has been put through this rest cure. She's not the only woman who has been told by her husband or her doctor to stop thinking about being sad, to stop being concerned about her mental health, and to, think positive thoughts and things like that. So she's speaking about herself, but she's also speaking about other women. Now, a lot of students ask me about this portion at the end when she's finally gotten all that wallpaper ripped off and she's creeping around the room. Has she, in her mind, become one with that figure behind the wallpaper? I would say yes, but again, we are reading the narrative of someone who has gone insane. So I tend to think of her and this woman who has gotten out from behind the wallpaper as kind of becoming the same person in her mind. But the point is that she feels like she has achieved some sort of freedom at the end, and she feels like the woman in the wallpaper has also achieved some sort of freedom. In a place, in a situation where she has no control, she finally feels like she has some control over something, and she has tried to assert that control over her cage, over this nursery where she's taken down this wallpaper that she hates so much. All right, I think those are all the symbols and all the themes that I'm going to talk about. I certainly left more for you to consider for the student who is going to choose this story. All right, so in the yellow wallpaper, you should have looked at the naturalism lecture, you should have looked at the narration notes, and this PowerPoint. Don't forget to take the quiz.